CSS specificity is one of the most important CSS concepts we need to understand as it determines how styles are applied to HTML elements. So let's take a look at the formal definition of the specificity from MDN. By the way, if you don't know what MDN is, MDN stands for Mozilla Developer Network, and it provides a lot of useful web resources including HTML, CSS, and JavaScript documentations and specifications. So, back to the definition of the specificity. The specificity algorithm calculates the weight of a CSS selector to determine which rule from competing CSS declarations gets applied to an element. So, it sounds a little bit complex, but simply put, it defines the rules that the browser uses to decide which CSS declarations should be applied when multiple rules target on the same element. So don't worry if you are unsure about it now. By the end of this video, you will have a clear understanding of how CSS specificity works. So far, we have learned type, class, ID, and universal selector. And here in this HTML and CSS code, we are using both type and class selector targeting on the same div element. So, what should happen if we try to apply multiple rules on the same element? So in this case, we are trying to apply both blue and red color to the same div element. So how should the browser decide which color it should apply? Should it be blue or red? So in this case, the font color of the div element will be red because the class selector has higher specificity than the type selector. So let's find how we can calculate the CSS specificity so we know which has higher specificity than the others. To calculate the CSS specificity, we can use the CSS specificity score. CSS specificity score is calculated based on the kind of selectors and number of selectors used in the CSS rule. Let's talk about the kind of selectors first. Normally, the CSS specificity score comes with three parts. So ID, class, and elements. And the element is the type selectors targeting on the HTML element. So throughout this course, when we talk about the specificity, I might use the element and types interchangeably, but basically, they are the same. So the ID has highest specificity, so it overrides the styles specified by any classes or types in the same HTML element. The class has lower specificity than the ID, but higher specificity than the element, and the element has the lowest specificity. So depending on what kind of selectors we are using, the specificity scores will get affected. Now, let's talk about the number of selectors used in the rule. So how many selectors used in the CSS rule will change the specificity scores too. So for example, if we have one ID selector, the score will be 1, 0, 0. Later, we are going to learn the descendant combinator, but basically we can have multiple children selectors together like ID A and then ID B. And because there are two IDs, it will be 2, 0, 0. How about adding class here? So we have a 2 ID, so it will be 2. And we have one class, so it will be 1. And no type element, so it will be 0. So it will be 2, 1, 0. How about A, B, C, and div type element? And it will be 2, 1, 1. Now, one thing to note is that the specificity score is not working exactly like numeric. So what I mean by that is, so let's say we have 11 type elements in a selector, then you might be thinking that the score will be something like 0, like 11, because it sounds like 11 here, but actually it is not. The specificity score actually will be 0, 0, 11. And that means no matter how many type elements we have, so let's say like 100, which will be 0, 0, 100, the only one class selector will get higher specificity than 100 type selectors. So this is very important to understand when you work on CSS, so that you know why certain styles get applied over the other styles to the HTML elements. Now, let's talk about the universal selector. The universal selector wasn't included in the calculator because the specificity score for the universal selector is always lower than the other selector, such as ID, class, and type selector, and will get overridden by those selectors. Alright, lastly, one of the good ways to check the specificity score is to go to this website. So you can find this link in the resources section below the video. And yeah, so basically like you can add the selectors here to see the scores. So for example, if I add ID, then it will be 100, but let's add two IDs, let's say Ryan, and it will be 200. And if we add a class, it will be 210. And then finally, let's add div, and it will be 211. So later, we are going to learn more complex selectors, and this tool is going to be very useful to check the scores. So I recommend to bookmark this page and revisit this if you need to calculate the specificity scores later. And also, if you wanted to deep dive into CSS specificity, I have published this article here in Frontendly website, and I talk everything you should know about CSS specificity. So please check this out too. So here you have it. This is specificity and how we can calculate the specificity score.